Jordan Peterson and Piers Morgan. Bro is a well, you don't know. Piers Morgan, I mean, no, not Piers Morgan. Jordan Peterson could be, I mean, I don't think he's like pro-Hamas, but he might be pro-Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We don't know. He could scream death to Israel at the top of his lungs at the start of this segment. I haven't watched it. I'm unfamiliar. You know what? Maybe he's a moderate. Maybe he's Fatah. Okay. Maybe he's in Muhammad Abbas's cabinet. We have no clue. Anyway, let's watch.
Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Jordan Peterson. Jordan, great to have you back on the program. A lot has happened since you were last on just a few weeks ago. I want to start by saying that I'm wrestling with a lot of moral quandaries about this war. And I'm hoping that through our conversation today, we might get to at least have some clarity about the moral quandaries and see if we can work out what we should be thinking about this, because I think it's very complicated and it's got to be nuanced, this conversation. Do you feel any moral quandaries about it?
Well, I don't think you can have a war without moral quandary. I mean, a war is the consequence of an unsolvable moral quandary. And so it's not surprising that the conversation surrounding the war is full of moral quandaries, because if it was straightforward and simple, and if there was an easy path forward, then there wouldn't be a war. And so, I mean, I can tell you what I think is going on to the degree that you can reduce it to something quickly explicable.
Wait, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think a lot of wars are I mean, not like simple in the idea that you don't need to know a lot, but simple in the idea that it's like, oh, there's like a lot of both sides. That's not always the case. I feel like everybody wants to be a centrist on everything so they can show how impartial and unbiased they are. But for example, Russian invasion of Ukraine, like, would you say that's it was an unsolvable moral quandary? No, it's the Russians wanted to dominate and conquer Ukraine on their path to building or reforming empire. I don't think that's an unsolvable moral quandary. I think the solution is pretty simple. It's don't build the empire. But I get what he's getting at, but I disagree.
No, I think Iran is desperate because of the tenuous hold on power that the mullahs now have in Iran, given their own citizens' rebellion. I think they see the Abraham Accords, which were the most significant step forward towards peace in the Middle East for like 75 years. They see the Abraham Accords as an existential threat. This is a last-ditch attempt by the Iranian mullahs to use the Islam against Jews story to prop up their own dismal reign. And so they rattled the chain of their Hamas puppets and said, provoke, and they did, and their hope is that
how the fuck does he doesn't know that? How does he know that Hamas... Wait. Was there an intelligence report that was published that I didn't know about? Was there some recent report that's happened recently that I don't know about? Because as far as I know, while Iran has certainly supplied both Hezbollah and Hamas with weapons, we have yet to find any evidence directly connecting Iran to the attacks, as in planning them or telling them to do it, etc. So I don't know if he has sources within the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps or something, but as far as I know, that is not a fact. We don't know that.
The response will be so overwhelming that the Arab world turns against.
And people ask, like, how did people fall for that weapons of mass destruction thing in Iraq? How did that? We'll never figure that out, huh?
Against them, and maybe even the people who might be inclined to, be swayed by a victim narrative in the West, and that the Abraham Accords will fall apart, and that'll be the end of that, and that could happen, and I'm hoping it won't, because I think the Abraham Accords were, and it's irritating to me, for whatever utility that is that I think I know, insofar as you can know such things, that Saudi Arabia would have signed the Abraham Accords 2 years ago if Biden would have moved a little bit more forthrightly on it. And I think the reason that he didn't and the Democrats didn't was because they didn't want to give Trump any credit for anything that he had attained in his administration. And I think all of...
Okay, that's just fucking delusional. The idea that Biden avoided trying to pursue Saudi Arabian and Israeli normalization of relations, which would have been to his administration and to his, maybe not big for like garnering a ton of support, but it would have been seen as a victory for the Biden administration. The idea that he didn't do it just to make it not look like Trump got a W in some way, I think that's silly. We don't have any evidence of that. I mean, why would we? Definitely, as Biden is trying to keep Saudi Arabia in the keep America in the good graces of Saudi Arabia, why would we undermine the normalization process with America's main ally in the Middle East, Israel? It doesn't make any sense. Just to spite Trump? I don't know. I feel that's delusional. I mean, we know that, like, for example, Trump started the withdrawal process from Afghanistan. Biden finished it. So if there is something that Trump was doing that Biden vaguely agrees about, even if he doesn't agree with the method he was using, I don't believe that he would undermine that process just to get at Donald Trump.
That is appalling. And, you know, I see this story of Muslim against Jew being put forward in this propagandistic manner, and I think, well, the Muslim world has to make a choice too, because it doesn't look to me like their proper champions is the government in Iran. You know, and it's not like the Saudis don't have their flaws, and perhaps the rest of the Arab governmental structures, but the Islam world should move in the direction of the Abraham Accords. That would be great for everyone. We could have a real peace. We could have something approximating a union of the Abrahamic people, and I think the accord was named extraordinarily well. Or we could have what we've had for the last 75 years with the Palestinians as perpetual cannon fodder, you know, at the beck and call of those for whom having them be cannon fodder is useful. And so, yeah, well, there's just moral quandaries everywhere there.
I do kind of agree with that sentiment.
It's a minefield, but that's what I think is the fundamental reality of the current situation. It's a propaganda war, and there's a lot at stake.
On October the 7th, Hamas obviously committed a terror attack of appalling magnitude. Where were you when you first heard about it, and what was your instant feeling about it?
Well, my instant feeling was to be sickened by it, you know, and it hasn't been that long since I was in Jerusalem, and so it was a little closer to me than it might have otherwise been. I'm also more sensitive to any signs of anti-Semitic catastrophe.
Mighty_Bombjack gifted 10 tier 1 subscriptions. Hell yeah, dude.
Hey man, I appreciate that. 10 tier 1s. We've been getting good support today. We got some good support earlier. We got 5 we got Shaved. He dropped 5 in Gutter Chat and in Site Chat. We got some subs before that, and now Mighty Bombjack with the 10 tier 1s to Felix, Hidden Martin, 123, Space Cat, Hayek, Pinto, Nordstrom, Bright Page, JTF, and Comrade Robin Hood. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Actually, thank you.
Studying the Holocaust for the length of time that I did, and I've always regarded Jews as the canary in the coal mine, and I think the reason that the Jews are the canary in the coal mine is because they're a successful minority. You know, and if a culture can tolerate a successful minority, it's pretty damn robust and it's not very resentful. And as soon as a culture starts to get resentful, the Jews make an easy target because they're a minority, and so well, that's an easy target to begin with. But then they're the minority that has the temerity to be successful. And that really brings the resentful out of the rat holes. And I've seen a rise in anti-Semitism online over the last 3 years. It's just stunning to behold, on the right and on the left, but jointly. And then, well, so I was sickened by it, but then I was also immediately suspicious of Iran's role. And I mean, that doesn't require any particular perspicacity on my part. I think it's quite obvious, but that also opens up the rat's nest of the maneuvering, the political maneuvering around the Abraham Accords, because, you know, I was very ill when the Abraham Accords were signed, and I couldn't or hadn't paid much attention. And when I sort of recovered my ability to see again, I saw that this remarkable peace process had taken place, and I could not understand for the life of me why it wasn't trumpeted on the front page of every newspaper across the world. And I also think that Trump's team should...
Number one, The Abraham Accords normalized relations with a few Arab states, and I know Bahrain just like pulled back its normalization process, pulled back its embassy after Israel's bombing campaign in the Gaza Strip. I believe that the Abraham Accords were a good thing, but people were saying that it brought peace to the Middle East. Obviously, we can see from Israel's bombing campaign in Gaza and the Hamas attack in southern Israel, that is not the case. It wasn't the case in any way, even before that, whether it has to do with the civil war in Syria, the fighting in Yemen, the continued fighting in northern Iraq, whatever. Like, it's just the bombing campaign from the Turks. Like, it's just not true. But it did normalize relations. I don't know if it would be
Occurred is occurred.
My goodness.
Stickasnersk has donated $100.
Wow.
Here is some money to combat demonetization, but can also be used for vodka.
Look, I'm going to be honest. I'm not a vodka guy. The only reason I drink vodka here is when I'm with somebody else and they're asking me to drink vodka. Like, Dylan, drink, be real Cossack. Then I'll drink vodka because then I'm being peer pressured and I am a victim of peer pressure of the highest order. But I will use it. Buy whiskey. And I do appreciate that. Thank you for the $100, but most of it's just going to go back into the channel. Thank you. I do appreciate it. Man, you guys have been really helping out the channel with demonetization. Thank you. Genuinely. What was I saying? Oh, yes, Abraham Accords. If Israel sparks war or Hamas sparks war with Israel, we can see how quickly, once this issue comes up again, how it can deteriorate relations in the region. And the Trump administration failed and failed drastically. And even it's like, I don't even know how to describe it. It's quite frankly pathetic proposal to the Palestinians and their peace plan. Their peace plan was they're going to make the illegal annexations of the West Bank permanent. They're going to do no land swaps in any valuable land
Burns
except
is immoral,
a little strip of land in the middle of the fucking desert with no industry, no infrastructure, no nothing. And Israel will be able to dominate them with their own military, as in they don't get a military. Israel will still dominate the area with their military. And it just, the whole proposal was dog shit. It was awful. And of course the Palestinians didn't accept it. And with that issue not being accepted, and with it being kicked down the road, the can being kicked down, eventually the can came up again. And it started to now make the Abraham Accords and all the progress that we did make buckle. It undermined the normalization process between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Bahrain is now pulling back its normalization. I don't know how successful normalization would be in the long term if the issue of Palestinian occupation is not dealt with. I do know, though, that if it isn't dealt with, it's going to make it 10 times harder. And this is just a good example of the Abraham Accords not being expansive enough and including what one of the main, if not the main issue is between Israelis and the rest of the Arab world, and as a continued occupation of Palestinian land. There's never going to be a day where Israel doesn't exist, or Palestine will be free from the river to the sea and now Israel is gone. That's never going to happen. Nobody should be under any delusion of that. But if Israel is not even willing to stop what is internationally recognized as an occupation of Palestinian territory now, and deny 1/3 of the entire refugee community of the world a state, and continue their perpetuation of being a stateless people, perpetuating the conflict, this is going to come up again in a few years, and then any of the work that's still around from the Abraham Accords will once again be threatened. This issue cannot continue to be perpetuated. It has to be resolved if you want strong, stable normalization processes.
Got a Nobel Peace Prize for it. I cannot see how you could possibly make a counter-argument to that for all of Trump's flaws and for his administration's flaws. This was a major accomplishment. And yet, and I know...
Dylan, don't you think that demilitarized for an ex-terrorist state makes sense, at least temporary, for 10 to 20 years? My problem isn't necessarily that Palestine be demilitarized for a certain period of time. My problem is that they made that demand on top of a bunch of other demands that, when stacked all on top of each other, are completely unreasonable. If the demand was, we'll leave Palestinian territory, but because we don't trust Hamas, we don't trust Palestinian Islamic Jihad, we want a demilitarization process for at least 10 to 15 to 20 years, or until there's elections, something like that. That'd be reasonable. But when you stack that on top of annex occupied land, when you stack that on top of no good land swaps, you just get this tiny strip of territory in the desert. When you stack that on top of you can't pass through Israel, you're going to have to use this underground tunnel system to go between the West Bank and Gaza. When you stack all these things on top of each other, then the deal is just garbage and it's a non-starter. And that's what the proposal was. It was a non-starter. Do we have can we actually pull up the Trump Palestine peace deal? Now, I don't think he'd be proposing much good peace deals now, with Trump saying for every drop of blood that is spilled, we must spill a gallon of theirs. But here was his vision for peace. You see that strip of land in the middle of, it's literally in the middle of the desert. They annex a lot more than what was proposed last time in the Oslo Accord. A lot more. This looks a lot more like what the Palestinians said the first proposal was when they criticized it, and the Israelis said, no, we weren't that crazy. Well, this looks like that proposal now. This was a non-starter. Anyway.
Oh, the Saudis were behind it. You know, they didn't sign it, but it wouldn't have gone forward without their nod and wink. And I believe that if Biden would have taken the opportunity and been a bit magnanimous in his response to Trump, which he could have been, instead of thinking of him as Satan himself, that he could have enticed the Saudis into a peace accord. And
he doesn't know that. He has no frame of reference for that. Why? So would a war between Israel and Hamas have not undermined the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel? What could have Biden done differently that would have caused peace, not peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel? I hate when people call it peace, because it's not peace. They're not at war, but normalization. I want to hear it. Love to hear it, because that's not something Biden wants to avoid. Biden wants that. Biden wants normalization. It'd be a victory for him.
Wouldn't be in this damn situation now. And now we're playing it out the hard way, you know, because the Iranians could win the propaganda war, and they've got, God only knows how many agents they have in the West, you know, promoting the kind of social upheaval that we've seen on the streets in the last few weeks. And so the narrative could go either way. But I'm rooting hard for the Abraham Accords signees, and I hope they have the courage of their convictions, and I hope they can see that their way forward is the most appropriate way forward for the good of the Muslim world. Or what, are we going to stay in some 14th century conflict between the fundamentalist Muslim world and the Jews? Jesus, that sounds, you know, we've had enough of that, haven't we? You'd think.
I asked Ben Shapiro, what is a proportionate response to what happened on October the 7th? And he said there isn't one, that there is no proportionate response, and there shouldn't be. I mean, that in itself, you know, I asked Vivek Ramaswamy when I interviewed him at the weekend the same question, and he was basically inferring the...
Nobody should take what Vivek Ramaswamy says about foreign policy seriously. Nobody. You get the same result if you go talk to like a kindergartner about foreign policy. Somebody with no experience, no clue what they're talking about, just throwing shit at the wall that just sounds good to them with no experience. Like, why don't Israel and Palestine just make Ismailistine and all like get along? It's that level of just idiocy. Definitely when you look at his Russia-Ukraine peace proposal, the idea of just citing his proposal, his ideas and conversations. God, man. Being a Silicon tech bro does not mean you can solve all the world's problems.
When I interviewed him at the weekend, the same question, and he was basically inferring the same, but he also said that you know, he would happily put the heads of 100 Hamas leaders on stakes along the border as a message to people not to commit this act.
See what I mean? He's a fucking child. We're gonna take the heads of terrorists and line the walls with their bones. Get the fuck out of here.
Burns
Unserious.
Immoral.
TechMop 12. Thank you so much for the tier 1. I appreciate it. Why can't Israel and Palestine just talk it out? True. They need marriage counseling. That's what they really need.
I thought that was a sort of medieval barbaric response to medieval barbarism, and that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is not the solution. I also believe that Israel has a fundamental right not just to defend itself after what happened, but has a duty to protect its people, and it has to take that duty obviously very seriously. But if your mission statement, as they've made clear, is to eliminate Hamas completely, and Hamas live in Gaza surrounded by civilians, among civilians, you can only do that. You can only get rid of Hamas with massive civilian casualties. And that's where I have this moral quandary about how much is too much.
Well,
does Israel get a license to do whatever it wants to eliminate Hamas, or should there be a limit? And if so, what is that limit?
well, I don't think Israel will have a license to do whatever it wants, because what will happen inevitably, and I think if I was an Iranian propagandist, I would be counting on this. Let's imagine that Israel moves against Hamas with its usual effectiveness, and they start winning, you know, in a serious way, and the casualties mount. Well, it's a lot easier to...
Wait, I saw Camel was in chat. Was Camel seriously supporting the October 7th attacks? I just wanted to clarify what he meant by violence is justified. I just wanted to get clarification. And if you are, okay, you can come in here and we can just talk about it now. If not, then good. But you can't just say that and then not have to defend that. Because if you don't defend it, then I'm not going to have you in your community. Because that means not only are you a sympathizer with just like terrorism and like a brute, but then on top of that, you're also a bitch. And I don't... Liking terrorism is bad enough, but being a bitch on top of it's too much. Okay? So I would just want some clarification.
to take a victim appreciation stance against a power that's clearly winning. So Israel can't win without accruing losses along the way, because the more they manifest their military superiority, the easier it's going to be for those who cast the Palestinians as victims to gain the moral upper hand. And that doesn't mean I know what Israel should do, because I wish I had that wisdom. But what I would like to see happen, in the best of all possible worlds perhaps, would be for the signees of the Abraham Accords to say to Israel, privately first, we're not budging. And then maybe to take a foray into the public and say that. It would be lovely to see Saudi Arabia come out and say, you know, we're going to continue the Abraham Peace Accord process. And then Israel could say, well, if the Abraham Accord holds and we have the probability of expanding it, we can take the risk of not being so devastating in our response to Hamas, and they could back off. But because there'd be a counter victory in it for them. And so as far, like, I can't see a better pathway forward than that. And I think that's a potentially realistic pathway, especially because that would also have the side benefit of not allowing Iran to prevail. So that's the best I can do on how this might proceed in the...
So what, his proposal is, in return for normalization with Saudi Arabia, they don't go hard on Hamas. That's the proposal. That's the idea. I mean, that will not be able to stop a war. It would have to be more than that. I mean, it would have to be like the hostages would have to be let go that's like the bare minimum. But this is a hell of a long shot. I mean, I'm not against at least trying, but it's a long shot for sure.
In the most optimistic possible way. And I don't know if that's good enough or not.
On October the 7th, you tweeted, "Give them hell, Netanyahu, enough is enough," and you got some blowback for that, as everybody
a lot
says anything about this. Were you surprised by the scale of the blowback? Do you wish you'd phrased that tweet differently? Do you have any regrets about it?
Well, you know, Twitter is a very complicated social media platform, and it's been difficult for me to learn how to use it wisely. And I'm not alone in that, because it's difficult to be wise on Twitter. Now, what I'm trying to learn is when a tweet is appropriate and when a long-form commentary is appropriate. And the rule, I think, is something like the higher the stakes, the more likely that the long-form commentary is necessary. And really, it would have been better had I, because I did release a YouTube video where I explained some of what we already talked
Yes,
about.
I saw it, yeah.
That, and that was, well, that was received much better, let's put it that way, but it also gave me a chance to elaborate my argument. And so what it highlighted for me, and I felt, you know, I was very taken aback by what happened in Israel. And I was also appalled because in my estimation it was unnecessary. As I said, the Abraham Accords could have been extended earlier, and maybe this wouldn't have been necessary.
How would the extension of the Abraham Accords have stopped Hamas from attacking southern Israel? Does he believe it's just like, at the end of the day, it's Hezbollah who gives the orders, and no attack happens without Hezbollah's approval? Not Hezbollah, I mean Iran. And that if the Abraham Accords were extended, that Iran, and because that's his theory, that it was Iran who gave the order, basically. So if we would have extended the Abraham Accords, then Iran would have been placated, and then therefore Iran would have told Hamas not to attack. I have no clue. I have no clue. I do not think extending the Abraham Accords without resolving the Palestinian occupation would have stopped an inevitable attack from either Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas. Israelis could have been better prepared for it, so all those people didn't die. But if you continue to perpetuate this conflict, eventually it's going to come back up again, like it has done every single other time.
And so I allowed myself to express some sentiment at that point without providing context, and that wasn't as good as providing the context. And I'm rethinking Twitter overall at the moment about how to use it. You know, Elon has taken off the character limit, and he's also made it possible to distribute video. And so it no longer has to be a place where impulsive exchanges can occur rapidly. And I'm trying to reconfigure how I use it. I'm much happier with the video. Now, you know, I was upset because I had developed somewhat of a Muslim following on YouTube, and I was very happy about that. A lot of people on the Islamic side of the world were watching my biblical lectures, for example, and you know, and I've had extensive conversations with Muslims on my YouTube channel. And you know, I burnt some of that up, and I'm not sure I did that. Well, I would say I'm certain I didn't do that in the most productive manner. And so, do I regret it? It would have been
Jordan Peterson can no longer lead the caliphate.
Better to do the long form, to have done the long form to begin with, you know?
He will never
Twitter
be the caliph.
Invites and rewards a certain amount of impulsivity, and it wasn't, I don't know, Piers, I don't know if it's ever time for impulsive action, especially when the stakes are serious, you know?
Yeah,
and so,
I completely get that. I mean, there's no doubt, for example, that what happened on October the 7th was a form of hell for the victims and for their families. There's also no doubt that for many living in Gaza, for many innocent Palestinians, as we know, of the 2 million or so residents and citizens there, I think it's more than half are of child age, and many are very young children, and many children are getting killed. And as a father, I'm sure as like me, as a father, it is utterly heartbreaking to see so many thousands of children being killed who have nothing obviously to do with this. Again, this comes back to this moral quandary I have. You know, it's interesting when you said enough is enough in that tweet. You know, some people.
I have met a lot of Jordan Peterson fans, and there are actually Jordan Peterson fans in Ukraine. The ones I met were in right sector. I don't know if that says anything, but what's the appeal? I never got it. I get the, you know, make your bed life advice stuff. But when he starts getting into these other topics, like this war and just starts spinning his yarn about the Abraham Accords, or like when he said when he talked about the war between Russia and Ukraine and he tried to connect it to like woke culture and cancel culture and all this other stuff. It was fucking nonsense. What keeps people watching that? Is it just this man told me to make my bed, I started making my bed, that was an improvement, so I must have a lot of good knowledge. So this man who is a psychologist who knows, you know, stuff around how you can balance out your life when it comes to making your bed, cleaning your room, stuff like that. He's now an international relations theory major. He's now a expert on Middle East politics, the history of Ukraine. If he just sticks to the stuff that he originally wrote that book about, 12 Rules for Life, then he'd be fine. But he keeps pivoting out into other fields that he doesn't know a lot about, while also like speaking on them authoritatively. Like, remember when he was talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine? He was like, you guys didn't care about this before. Remember the Holodomor? He meant to say Holodomor. He said Holodomor. Now, I mispronounce words sometimes too. But you cannot get on a high horse like you don't know about and then mispronounce the thing. Homolador. Yeah, it was Homolador. Sounds like a anti-gay pogrom. Anyway, I just don't get the fucking appeal outside of he offered life advice. Now what? Is he viewed like a father figure and that's why you're taking his, like, just taking his stuff at face value? Why?
People are already saying, even if they're very sympathetic to Israel's need to take out Hamas, they're looking at these fairly apocalyptic scenes in Gaza and thinking, enough is enough of that. You know, in other words, that the revenge is already far greater in terms of death toll than the original appalling terror attacks. That, again, is where I have a moral quandary.
Well, the question is, I suppose, and I don't purport to have an answer to this, is the most effective way of combating Hamas military? And part of the answer to that is the military eradication of Hamas even possible? Because as I said...
Oh my God, this is a good question. This is, oh, Jesus Christ. Jordan Peterson's asking a smart question, actually.
And we can see it unfold.
By the way, it is possible. But the question is, can Israel achieve it? And if Israel was to achieve it, would they be able to achieve it alone, considering how much of Hamas's leadership is brought overseas? And how much attention, like, the movement will get with this invasion?
Holding in real time, as Israel's more successful militarily and the casualties mount, the resistance to what they're doing is going to grow.
Yeah.
And so even if they could take out Hamas militarily, which isn't obvious given its interpenetration with the civilian population.
I don't agree with that. I think Israel, if they really wanted to, they could take over the entirety of the Gaza Strip. They have the military power to do that. But the idea, when you make the standard eradicate Hamas, it wasn't we're going to eliminate Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It was we're going to eradicate Hamas. Hamas fighters are going to flee out of Israel, out of Gaza Strip, under the idea that they'll come back later once Israel leaves, or they'll take the fight abroad and fight Israeli assets elsewhere. Maybe they'll launch attacks from Syria. Maybe they'll launch attacks from southern Lebanon. Maybe they'll launch attacks from Jordan. Who knows? They have tunnel systems that can get out of the country if necessary. So when you say eradicate Hamas, like if I said what I want to do in office is I'm going to eradicate ISIS. I'm going to destroy ISIS. I didn't say I'm going to destroy ISIS's territorial holdings. I'm going to destroy ISIS, terrorist organization. That means you can't just destroy the territory they control. You got to go around, dig in the tunnels, find out where the strongholds are and safe bases and safe places across the world. Eradicating ISIS is going to take a lot more than just making it so they can't hold a village. It's going to mean finding out where they're hiding out, finding out where their resources are, where they get funding from, getting them off from that funding, and building up a support structure so people do not feel compelled to listen to ISIS's rhetoric. Same thing when it comes to Hamas. If you don't want people to join Hamas, you got to give them other options. And occupation is not an option that the Palestinians are willing to accept.
All of what's going to be played out is going to be played out on the military front. And we can see that in the rising tide, let's say, of demonstrations around the Western world. And I would say those demonstrations are likely to get larger and more effective in precise proportion to Israel's success on the military side. And so then I would think, well, is there another way of restraining Hamas? And well, that brings us back to the Abraham Accords, because they were the most promising thing that's happened in 7 decades. You know, and I think it's easy to underestimate what a miracle they were. The people who formulated the Abraham Accords had to fight the State Department. They tried to introduce it under Obama to begin with, right? The notion was, well, maybe we could start the peace process with Israel without putting the Palestinians first. And that had been off the table conceptually in the State Department, as far as I've been informed, forever. And then it was proposed during the Obama era, and it was rejected. And then it was proposed during the beginning of the Trump era and rejected, but eventually they carried the day. And then they did do an end run. And I think that was actually good for the typical Palestinian, because it put a tremendous amount of pressure on the Palestinian authorities, who are basically tyrants, who are more than willing to use their own citizens as cannon fodder. It put a lot of pressure on them to actually do something moving towards a genuine peace, which is why now that's why Iran is so desperate to scuttle the accords, I think.
Of course.
You know? So I think the way through Hamas, all things considered in the medium to long run, is to desperately extend the Abraham Accords as rapidly as possible. That's not a military victory, but you know, it's easy to do this from the armchair.
When you look at the full history of this conflict.
So wait, for those of you who are skeptical of the idea that Iran could possibly have not known about this attack, understand a few things. Number one, there have been instances like this that have happened in the United States. For example, the American government is still saying that it was the Ukrainian government that tried to assassinate and kill Daria Dugina. But the Ukrainian government still denies it, and according to all of the reports I've seen, we have no indication that they told the United States that they were going to be doing it beforehand. Now, that could be for a few reasons. Number one, maybe they don't want the American government to know that they could be possibly involved in those types of assassinations, even though we don't still know it for sure that it was them. But it could also be that if they tell the Americans, maybe somehow it leaks out, either in the communication process or from a leak in the United States, like what happened with the Jack Textera leaks. So if you're Hamas and you're going to try to conduct this big surprise attack on Israel, there might be some concern that if they start telling people about their plans, Israel will hear word of it, and then they'll foil the attack. So, and again, like, we have had examples when allies that we're supporting haven't told us everything that's going on, and I assume the same thing happens within Iranian politics as well. So I'm not saying that we know that Iran didn't have knowledge, or we know Iran wasn't involved. I'm just saying we don't have any evidence, and it's not completely unbelievable that they might have not known or not been involved in it.
Conflict, the 7 decades of conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Jonathan Friedland is a very good, respected Jewish journalist for The Guardian in the UK. He wrote a very interesting column the other day saying, you know, you could argue that both sides have a just cause here. And he said that as a leading Jewish commentator, that historically both sides have a just cause, and that it's important to remember that. And that's why passions run so high. It's why people care so much. And it's why racing to take sides is a mistake in this conflict. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that, you know, if there wasn't a lot to be said on both sides, then the conflict wouldn't drag on forever and be unresolvable. You know, I think at some point you do something like cut the Gordian knot, which I do think to some degree the Abraham Accords had begun to do. You know, I don't think Israel's going away.
I'm sorry. What does he think the Abraham Accords did? How was the Abraham Accords going to bring peace between Israel and Palestine? Whatever. You got to make a deal with the Palestinians. You can't just make deals with everyone around them.
But I don't think the Palestine isn't going away either. And so those things have to be accepted. It looks to me like they have to be accepted as on-the-ground realities. Now, the problem I've seen continually, I don't know, is that it's been convenient to use the Palestinians as an irritant to Israel in the West. And so the Palestinians have been held hostage. You know, the people who portray them as innocent victims presume that the Palestinians have been held hostage by the Jews, let's say. But I would say the Palestinians have been held hostage even more effectively by their own leadership and by those who are perfectly willing to use them as the front man, the expendable front man to irritate Israel in the West. Well, you can't get peace under those circumstances, you know, and so Palestine is a reality that isn't going to go away, and Israel's a reality that isn't going to go away, and the Abraham Accords started to recognize that, and there was move in the right direction, and if that falls apart, we're going to be back to where we were 15 years ago, except worse.
The interesting moment for me came when Israel turned off the power and the water. They just were able to do that to 2 million people in Gaza. They could turn off the internet. And it struck me that that was a very vivid reminder that Israel effectively controls Gaza. It doesn't do so politically, but it does in reality. And that for many young people in Gaza, they know this, and they do feel that they've been living in a perpetual prison camp where their movement is controlled, where their access to basic things like water and energy and so on is controlled, and that until they get the freedom that they crave, this can never get resolved.
Well,
but I also understand on the understand on the other side that the Israelis feel, how can we give freedom to a place that is run by a terror group who are literally committed to the eradication of not only Israel but all Jewish people?
Well, you laid out what are the two sets of valid counterclaims. I mean, there's another complicating factor too. You know, you said that you know your moral back is up because of the continual toll in civilians in Palestine, especially among people who, let's say, weren't even born when they first came to power. And so it's very difficult to look at that and see it as anything but unjust. But then it begs a whole other set of questions too, doesn't it? It's like, well, if your government is a totalitarian band of armed criminal thugs, what responsibility do you bear for that as the subjected people? And you know, it's not like I know the answer to that, but you know, I see in my own country in Canada that things are slipping and sliding in all sorts of pathological directions, and people
Come on. You know, Trudeau is a lot like Hamas. When you think about it, Trudeau's government has acted much like Hamas does. You know, Trudeau called one of my friends racist. Hamas threw that guy off of a building. You know, they're very similar in a lot of ways.
People are letting it happen. And if you let that happen long enough, well, things get very, very bad. And they have got very, very bad in Palestine. And the answer to whatever tyranny Israel might be exerting over the Palestinians isn't for the Palestinians to exert even more tyranny over themselves, especially not in concert.
In chat just said he doesn't think Justin Trudeau and Hamas are that similar at all. Well, that's because you're a dumb liberal.
With a third party like Iran, who's perfectly willing to sacrifice them at any point. And so now, and then that question emerges, well, what responsibility do the Palestinians bear? Well, then I think we start to touch on more metaphysical issues. It's like, well, the Palestinians, like all people, bear the responsibility to live in truth and to stand up to tyranny in their deeds, their attention and their deeds and their actions. Because if you don't, you pay for that, and so do your children, right? And then so do your grandchildren, and so do your great-grandchildren. And, you know, there seems to be something unjust in that why did the children suffer? And the biblical answer to that has always been, well, the children suffer for the sins of their forefathers. And you might think, well, it's pretty unfair that the world is set up that way. It's like, hey, it might be unfair, but it is set up that way, and it does beg the question. What responsibility do the people who are living under the thumb of totalitarians have for the fact that they're living under the thumb of totalitarians? And the answer isn't none. So this is why I'm a psychologist, not a politician. I would say,
But
because,
it's no,
you
but
know,
I think it's a really interesting question. It's also an interesting question. Why won't Arab states around Gaza take in Palestinian refugees? I mean, these are legitimate questions.
Right. Well, there's a lot of chain and saber rattling about how tyrannical Israel is, and of course, they're held to a very higher moral standard. But you know, the prison that is Palestine has walls on sides that aren't Israeli. So, and that.
Yeah, but we're also giving weapons to the Israel. I think it's a key difference. It is true, though, Egypt doesn't get much pressure from the international community to open its borders, even though Egypt would be one of the people who could open its borders and take in tons and tons and tons of Palestinian refugees who are currently trapped in Gaza. The Egyptian government, and I've already said this before, in case anybody hasn't heard it, the Egyptian government justifies not opening the border as by saying that if they were to accept the Palestinian refugees, the Palestinian refugees would end up staying in Egypt permanently, and then Israel would take over the Gaza Strip, and then it would be another Nakba. It'd be another great expulsion of Palestinians from their land. I think a lot of it really has to do with the fact that Hamas has ties, deep ties from its founding to the Muslim Brotherhood, and El-Sisi overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood when he came to power in a military coup. And so he's scared of the Muslim Brotherhood. Definitely when his economy is kind of looking like it's a little in the shits right now. By the way, I've been quiet about this the whole time. He needs to stop wearing that fucking suit. Okay? This suit is stupid. Like he's got the blue and the red and like the inside fire and like clouds on the inside. I've seen him wear that suit everywhere. I don't like it, man. I don't like to step on somebody's style. Not a fan of the suit. Not a fan. I think it looks like a clown suit. I feel like if you were to make a suit for a clown, an actual like circus clown, probably would look similar.
That no one, certainly not the progressives, will never talk about that, and that's partly because
Two-Face, though,
all the oppressed people are equally morally virtuous, and so the fact that the Arabs won't take in the Palestinians, you can't even bring that up because, of course, the Arabs themselves are victims of Western colonialism, which is one of the most absurd propositions ever set forth by anyone about.
What did he just say?
And that no one, certainly not the progressives, will never talk about that. And that's partly because, all the oppressed people are equally morally virtuous. And so the fact that the Arabs won't take in the Palestinians, you can't even bring that up because.
Who says that? What left-wing activists are saying, how dare you say Egypt should take in Palestinian refugees? That's terrible. I've never seen. Who's the left here? Who is he referring to? Like a local DSA rally? The Democratic Party? Like who? Fucking everybody I know, except for one person that I met once, who ended up apologizing for it anyway, want Egypt to open the border and let in the refugees so they can save their lives. Manic Shade, thank you so much for the prime. I don't know what he's talking about.
Of course, the Arabs themselves are victims of Western colonialism, which is, one of the most absurd propositions ever set forth by anyone about anything. But
what? Before Israel, there wasn't a Palestinian state in the Levant. It was the British Mandate. Colonial occupation. Lebanon, it was the French colonial rule. Iraq was invaded multiple times by the British, create their own colonial governments and aligned governments. Syria was controlled by French colonists. I mean, the idea that the region was not hurt by colonialism is ahistorical. He said it's the most ridiculous thing to have ever said that Arabs were hurt by colonialism. Is this right now? There is not American colonies in like Egypt or Lebanon or French colonies there. But to say that colonialism didn't hurt the region is just false. And you don't even need to say Western colonialism only. You could talk about the Ottoman Empire. You can talk about their policies or their treatment of religious minorities. You can go before the Western colonialism. But Western colonialism did have an impact on the region. It was the British who determined that Israel Israel and Palestine should be given to like 3 separate groups, pledged to 3 separate groups. The Balfour Declaration and a declaration to local Arab tribesmen when they were rebelling against the Ottomans that, no, don't worry, you'll get a free and independent Arab state. And then the colonialists came in and started snatching up land. So again, the idea that Western colonialism didn't hurt the Middle East, didn't hurt the Arab world, just a complete falsehood.
You know, here we are. And it is quite a miracle in some ways that the multidimensional fact of Palestinian enslavement isn't discussed in a much more forthright manner. There's many people are building the walls that make Palestine into whatever prison it is. And perhaps the Israelis are playing their role, but they're by no means the only actors.
Let's talk about the response of progressives, and in particular, what's happening on student campuses, particularly in America. You know, I've been struck by 2 things. One, the horrifying immediate response, not just in America, but when you saw mobs in Sydney, Australia, chanting "Gas the Jews," when you saw huge protests by the Israeli embassy in Kensington and West London, near where I live, all celebrating. This is all within hours of what happened on October the 7th. You saw similar scenes in America. So the gut reaction of many young people appeared to be celebrating what had happened. And you even had there was a Cornell professor who was heard in public saying how exhilarated he was by what happened, and still hasn't been fired. And these are people who've driven this cancel culture for many years now, where if you
Okay, I want to respond to something in chat because I've heard this mentality and this idea pushed before, and I just want to throw something out there. This is from Oyoyo. Most non-whites alive today owe their very lives to past European imperialism. Give me. And its global deployment of Europeans as Western science, technology, medicine institutions, and commerce. Just what do you think dropped infant mortality rates? The scientific developments that Europeans and Western leaders made during the colonial period were based upon scientific developments made by people before them. Sometimes it was Muslim scholars, definitely when it comes to mathematics. Sometimes it was Greek scholars. Math and science was a continually developing process between states. There's no one country that gave this to the world. There's no one state that gave this to the world. Certain Western states, like France, Germany, the United States, had scientific developments around science, around things like penicillin, that were extremely useful and built upon previous scientific developments, but it's never, ever, ever, ever this country or these states alone saved the world through medicine. That's not how it works. But putting that aside, there is things that Western countries, like the United States, have contributed to the world. But let's also not pretend that all the things that we've contributed to the world were good either. Whether you have penicillin doesn't matter that much if your hands are getting chopped up by a Belgian colonist who's been given orders by King Leopold to bring the Congolese in line so they farm rubber more efficiently. So you win some, you lose some, is I guess the phrase.
Use the wrong pronoun. They want you eradicated, fired, shamed, abused, and so on. But here, if you celebrate the actions of a terrorist organization in killing 1,500 people, you actually don't lose your job. Students who beamed pro-Hamas rhetoric onto the building at George Washington University, they haven't lost their places at that university. So even for the most heinous possible thing that you could do which might warrant cancellation, the people who've driven cancel culture spare themselves.
Well, this shows you how shallow the
We're talking about cancel culture 26 minutes into a video about the Israel-Hamas war where people are dying. Very serious political commentary.
Oppressor narrative really is. Oppressor narrative really is. You know, George Orwell famously said that the typical middle-class socialist didn't love the poor, they just hated the rich. And I think the oppressor-oppressed narrative gives people moral license to identify the oppressor and to hate them resentfully with a good conscience. Plus, it's also extremely simple-minded, you know, and this is one of the problems with what's being taught in universities, and even much more broadly than that now. The notion is we can view all human social relations and the past itself through a meta-Marxist narrative that proclaims that there are only oppressors and victims, and that all you have to do to be moral is to be on the side of the victim. Now, the shadow side of that is that once you proclaim your moral superiority and you're on the side of the victim, well, number one, you don't have to think anymore. You just have to identify the two sets of players. And number two, your moral...
Leopold II's Congo non-genocide of 10 million, the alternative hypothesis. And then you sent me a BitChute link. The fuck am I, what? Look, I'm gonna be for real. There is nothing that's ever been posted on BitChute that is worth watching. Nothing. The only time I ever watch anything on BitChute is if it's not available on YouTube and has been reposted there for copyright reasons. That's the only time. Most people don't even know what BitChute is. BitChute is like YouTube, but mostly for racists. Okay, that's the blunt way of putting it. But BitChute is basically a platform that is largely uncensored, unregulated in the same way that other platforms are. So what ends up happening is a lot of extremists and radicals and people who've been banned from other platforms end up uploading their content there. That's how a lot of neo-Nazis have ended up posting there. That's how a lot of religious extremists have ended up posting there. But also like random, I assume random people post there as well, like non-racists, but it's mostly for racists. It's mostly for racists. Are you Orwelling BitChute right now? Yeah, I'm Orwelling BitChute. So did you just send me a video that alleges that King Leopold did not actually kill a lot of Congolese people? That his rubber farming practices were actually not that bad and it's all just like a Western plot? Oh my God. You did do this. You sent me a video by... I know this guy. This guy's fucking insane.
Republic of the Congo killed 10 million people.
I think I know. No, I think I got him confused with someone else. It might be someone else.
This area was known as the Congo Free State.
Anyway, this is fucking bullshit. Give me something that's actual, like, historical record. Give me something that's not a fucking BitChute video. Fucking silly. Come on. Get out of here.
Without effort.
Maybe he was ironically posting the BitChute link. I'm going to assume he was ironically posting the BitChute link, okay? That's what I'm going to assume.
Because all you have to do is feel sorry for the victims. And then consequence number 3 is the oppressor, being intrinsically evil, can be the target of everything that's resentful and bitter and absolutely dreadful about you. Now, that's the standard narrative that's being taught on university campuses, and the Palestinians play the role of victim. And so you can't argue against the Palestinian cause, let's say, if you were inclined to, without simultaneously having to face the weight of every single person who's adopted the oppressor-oppressed narrative, upending that, and there's no way the university, not in the state they're in now, there's no way that's going to fly. And so we see exactly what happened. The narrative's already in place. All oppressed people are innocent and virtuous victims. Well, so then when something like this happens and you see the Palestinian victims rise up against their evil Jewish overlords, then it's time for celebration. You know, and we forget entirely that the evil Jewish overlord story was the same story that the Germans used so successfully. And we also forget, and this is very interesting in relationship to Iran, I was reading a book by Stefan Zweig yesterday about turn of the century Vienna, just at the end of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the dawning of the movements that eventually morphed into Nazism in Germany. And one of the things Zweig pointed out was that, you know, if you're a corrupt, oppressing psychopath who's hell-bent on exploiting the population, and you want to deflect that, the Jews make a constant, positive, universal target, right? Because they tend to be disproportionately successful. And you can just say, well, you know, I'm not the oppressor here. It's those successful Jews. and that's being played out now. That's the disguise of left-wing anti-Semitism.
I mean, it's a
we don't
terrifying-
hate the Jews, we just love their enemies.
Right, I mean, the anti-Semitic response in the last 3 weeks has been actually quite terrifying to watch. I've got Jewish friends who are literally living in real fear now, some of whom were in Israel at the time and thought, well, the world will rally behind us, and actually very quickly realized that in many cases that wasn't the case. In fact, the complete opposite. And then you saw these scenes in Dagestan at the airport with a mob literally charging around trying to find any Jewish passengers they could find. And it was, I mean, horrendous, but also, if you're Jewish, this is utterly terrifying and must take you right back to Nazi Germany, World War II, the Holocaust. This never again, it is beginning to happen again.
Well, I think we could be heartened in that regard by the counter position, though, too. I mean, I would say the reasonable majority in the Western world didn't take that stance still, and quite forthrightly. I mean, even my Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who virtually never says a true word in his life or makes a...
Fucking hates him.
His actions are concatenations of false gestures even. You know, he came out with a pretty forthright statement decrying what had happened on the Hamas side. And that has characterized the leadership of the West in general. And so I can certainly understand why the tiny minority of Jews that do exist.
I don't know what Western leader was like, you know what, actually, October 7th was a big meme. I don't think any Western leader has expressed that sentiment. I haven't seen that anywhere. So it's not generally. I think it's universally. At least in NATO alliance states.
In the world are terrified about what's happening. You know, there's no reason for catastrophic alarm. It's, you know what I mean? It doesn't look to me like this is going to spiral out of control. And I'm not even so certain that in the medium to long run it's going to be the worst possible thing, because you know too, the other thing that happened is that a lot of the false moral disguise of the progressive types was exposed in a radical way in the last few weeks. I mean, Harvard, for example, just took a beating. You know, I mean, first of all, Harvard was ranked dead last by fire in terms of its support for free speech. And then it was 32 different Harvard groups came out.
Imagine hating on BitChute, Lamal. I'll take my platform cucked and gimp, please. I don't know if he's talking to me or talking to somebody else, but it's not that I don't like BitChute as like a concept. It's just that every time I go on BitChute, like all the top recommended videos is like how black people suck, how Jews suck, how this minority group sucks, how we can solve all the world's problems if we just got rid of all the minority groups I don't like. It's just like BitChute's dominated by those people. Like if you make up website that is for those who get censored on other platforms, a lot of the people who get censored on other platforms weren't censored because they were saying truthful, amazing, fantastic things. It's because they were fucking like terrible people saying horrible things. That's not always the case, but it often is.
Essentially in support of Hamas, and then a whole variety of CEOs said they wouldn't accept a Harvard degree as a hiring criteria, and Larry Summers came out and said, you know, the previous president of Harvard, that the institution had become so corrupt that it wasn't salvageable. Then, you know, the White House press secretary decried the actions of the squad who were supporting the Hamas protests, you know, so we're seeing cracks on the progressive side.
Wait. Back the fuck up. Back the fuck up. What did he just say?
You know, the previous president of Harvard, that the institution had become so corrupt that it wasn't salvageable. Then, you know, the White House press secretary decried the actions of the squad who were supporting the Hamas protests, you know, so we're seeing cracks on the progressive.
There's no member of the squad that supports Hamas protests. There's members of the squad that I would imagine that are saying things like, you know, end the occupation or supported protests for a ceasefire. There is no pro-Hamas members of Congress. Get the fuck out of here. He's on cloud nine. He's off the planet Earth. He's tuned into a totally different radio frequency than the rest of us.
progressive side because of this that haven't been evident before. You know, and Biden himself came out and talked about how important it was to push forward with the Abraham Accord.
Let me just give you guys a frame of reference. When Ilhan Omar said all about the Benjamins in relation to the influence of pro-Israeli political PACs like AIPAC, do exist, do have financial influence, do have an impact on our politics. They don't control our country like many people out to be, but that lobby group is real. Because of the way she phrased it with all around about the Benjamins, people started to picture it as an anti-Semitic, like, oh, the Jews with their finance are taking over the country. And that's not what she meant, but that's how people took it. Or some people took it. And because some people took it that way, like the Democratic Party came out with a statement condemning it. There was questions about whether Ilhan Omar was going to be censored due to her comments. It was a gigantic scandal. And you're telling me that that's the reaction she got after saying all about the Benjamins in reference to pro-Israel lobby money. But she could be, or one of her colleagues could be, openly pro-Hamas, and it's barely caused a peep? Get out of here.
Which was something, you know, I wish he would have done 2 years ago, but better late than never. So I can understand why there's tremendous fear and uncertainty, but I certainly wouldn't say that all the news is bad.
Let's talk about social media for a moment. There's no doubt that the kind of tribalism that we see in modern society, fueled by social media, has probably never been worse than I've seen it in the last 3 weeks. A constant barrage of often completely fake imagery, videos, claims, counterclaims from both sides. But it's just a barrage. You know, I've been really quite shocked by just the scale of it and how little of it appears to even have a semblance of truth about it. Well, what do we do about this?
Oh, well, that highlights a very...
Dude, I saw somebody reposting. Can I actually bring this up? There was somebody, the lies on the platform are just getting so blatant. I saw Jackson Hinkle reposting old footage from a Syrian hospital getting bombed, and he condemning it, saying how if Assad, if Russia did this, then oh my God, then, you know, the West would immediately declare war. And didn't know, but the video he was posting was of Assad doing it because it was Assad bombing a hospital. He later deleted it. I guess he does have some shame. But stuff like that is happening constantly with millions upon millions of views going to videos that are supposedly of the war between Israel and Hamas, but are from Syria or from Iraq, from all over the place. The worst example, even though this post wasn't as popular as some of the others, which were getting millions upon millions of views, this is somebody saying Yemenis are serious with declaring war to Ziopigs in reference to Zionists. Finally, some justice that needs to be done in Tel Aviv. Dude, this is Baghdad. This is 2003. This is the start of the Iraq invasion. This is the start of the invasion of Iraq. This is like classic footage. And when I say classic footage, like this was on the screen of basically every American household at the start of the war. Everybody was watching. People were watching the live streams, live footage of Baghdad getting hammered by American aircraft. How do you get involved in Middle East politics or know anything about Middle East politics, see this video and conclude this was the Houthis? Number one, how would the Houthis even have that much destructive capacity? They don't. You don't see any missiles coming in. They're airdrop munitions. Whatever. Anyway, it's just getting so bad. The disinformation around this is getting so fucking awful.
Very pronounced danger. So, you know, in the last 15 years, we've erected virtual perceptual systems and virtual systems of representing reality. Now, if your system of representing reality is not in accord with reality, you're delusional. And right, technically, that's what a delusion is. And you're going to run into trouble when you try to act in your fantasy and run into the world. Well, these virtual worlds that we've erected on top of the real world don't run by the same principles as the real world. And that makes them delusional. And that delusional element is affecting us very badly in a couple of ways. I just heard Jonathan Haidt this morning talk about some of the research he's reviewing in his new book. He shows very clearly that young liberal women, the probability that a young liberal woman who saturates her life with social media has a mental illness is more than 50%. That's how bad it's got. Yeah, it's really bad.
How the fuck do you even study that? What? How do you study that? How would you, what is that even? Mental illness, like when he says mental illness, what is defined as mental illness? Like ADHD, like schizophrenia, like how do you even test for this? So would it be you poll the general population tells you their political beliefs, then you break down those political beliefs based upon mental health status? I don't know how you would even find this out. Does anybody know the poll he's referring to? The information, the study? You know, this is how I would study it. I would grab a liberal woman off of her, I would smack down the phone out of her hands, grab her shoulders and go, nightmare, 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 nightmare. And if they break down, then I count them as mental illness. If they don't, then I'm like, congratulations, you're healthy. And then they leave.
Bad. But that's not the only thing that's going on. You see, the other thing I've been watching, and this is really quite frightening to me, is that the problem with one of the problems with online communication is it disinhibits the narcissists and the psychopaths. And the reason for that is that they can circumvent the normal control systems that obtain in face-to-face interaction.
That's true.
You know, and in face-to-face interaction, there's things you will not.
There's so Bad Empanada would not act like Bad Empanada if he had to say the things he said to people's faces. This is true about all of the worst scumfucks on Twitter.
Not say or do, because you will be held responsible, and maybe immediately. You can say whatever the hell you want online, and you can get away with it too, and maybe even be rewarded for it. And so you just think about the amount of criminality and quasi-criminality online. 35% of internet traffic is pornographic. And it isn't nice guys that are running that. Let's put it that way. There's an immense amount of online criminality. Like, most people are targeted by online criminals on a pretty regular basis. And then we just have the run-of-the-mill narcissistic psychopaths who generate anonymous troll demon accounts who are spreading misery and sadistic hate as fast as they possibly can. And there's no barriers whatsoever to them doing that. And so then when something does happen that's contentious, let's say, the sadistic psychopaths just make hay out of that, right? They're spreading their misery as rapidly as they possibly can for the lulls and the lulzes and to delight in other people's suffering. And the social media companies are naive enough not to regulate that. Now, regulating it's difficult, but it's a conversation we have to have, Piers, because I think, like, if we let the psychopaths, that's 4% of the population, whenever they get the upper hand, and that happens from time to time, everything burns.
I also think that young people in particular, they are exposed to...
What is this?
I'm sorry for my Mafi Arabia. Just two things to say. One, football, it's coming home. Yeah! And number two, Palestine, hurrah!
That is Britain's number one bloke, man. Every person in Britain that you call a bloke looks like that man. That's like half of the British middle class right there.
Such relentless dopamine imagery, both still pictures, videos, whatever. And in particular, the last 3 weeks, if you're a young person with an impressionable mind and you're getting bombarded with some of the worst imagery imaginable, you know, babies dead.
Okay, you guys done with this? Mercado's ready for me. I'm done with this. There's nothing. I don't know what I expected from this Jordan Peterson talk. I didn't really get anything out of this. There's a few things I agreed with, but it was mostly just shallow commentary or just him like going out on a limb. Anyway, that's enough of this.